Welcome to the Grounded in Peace podcast, where we explore what it means to cultivate peace within ourselves while working toward a more just and harmonious world. Join us as we uncover stories, practices, and ideas that inspire grounded collaborative action for lasting change.
Okay, I'm here with John Crowley-Buck, who is the director of the Arrupe Social Justice Scholars Program at John Carroll University in the Cleveland area. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Craig, very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and so John oversees this scholars program, and I oversee a Peace Scholars program at Ashland University. And we met each other recently, and it occurred to me that we're very similar in our duties at our respective institutions. And so we're here to talk about social justice and the way that we involve students in that kind of work. And John Carroll's a Jesuit institution, so we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be at a Jesuit place and thinking about peace and social justice. So,
absolutely.
John, can you, first of all, share a little bit about your background and what has brought you to this place?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am native originally of Boston, Massachusetts, grew up on the East Coast, and my sort of academic world, my academic life has gone through a lot of Jesuit channels. I studied at Boston College, and I did my doctorate at Loyola Chicago. I worked for a few years at Georgetown University, and I came here to John Carroll really because the Jesuit ethos that has so shaped my experience and so shaped my commitments to education, to social justice, almost all of their existence to the Jesuits and Jesuit education. And so it's been a real pleasure for me to be able to see these different Jesuit schools in these different parts of the country, and really hone my own understanding of what it means to do social justice, let's say in a Jesuit key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as a fellow theologian, my knowledge of Jesuit social justice is linked with people like John Sobrino and liberation theology.
Of course.
Yeah. So, I mean, can you locate, can you say more about what social justice means to Jesuits? I mean, is how much of it is liberation theology, and kind of what is there in addition to that?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot. I would say when we think about social justice as it's articulated today in sort of Jesuit spaces, we sort of have to go back a little bit. In the Catholic world, the Jesuits, of course, maybe for those who don't know, are a religious order within the Catholic Church. We have to go back a little bit to the mid-20th century and really to the Second Vatican Council, right? This very important ecumenical council in the Catholic Church that invited Catholics from the Holy Father down to everyone at church on Sunday, right? To really revisit their faith, their commitments, their spirituality, and how the church encounters the world around it, right? And one of the commitments that comes out of the Second Vatican Council is really this recognition that the church has a responsibility to being in the world, right? And to bringing its centuries of learning and social work to the world, offering it, right, as something the church has to offer. And at this same time as the Second Vatican Council, and right in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, you also have the Jesuits, who have been sort of rebuilding, of course, from their own history, right? The Jesuit suppression. Once, in the decades after the suppression is lifted and the Jesuits are sort of rebuilding their house, so to speak, you finally get to the point where you have the confluence of the Second Vatican Council and the rise of a particular Jesuit in the order, Pedro Arrupe. Right. And Pedro Arrupe really serves as this incredible watershed figure for the society, and the way that it articulates its commitment to social justice, because that commitment did not emerge in the mid-20th century, right? That commitment we can trace back to the very writings of St. Ignatius of Loyola himself, right? Who founds the religious order of the Jesuits, he and his companions, right? So social justice has been something the Jesuits have been doing since the 16th century, right? But it gets articulated by Pedro Arrupe in a particular way, a commitment that we are to bring to the world, right? And this is from Arrupe, you begin to see, and from the Second Vatican Council, you begin to see the emergence of this, as you said, liberation theologies, this emergence of the commitment to social justice. And you find folks like John Sobrino or, of course, Ignacio Ellacuría, who articulate in this very really grassroots way what it is, why it is that the church ought to speak to the issues of its time, right? And so the Jesuits become more actively engaged in this work. They have different apostolates, education being one of them, of course. But we begin to see the development of social justice as something emerging not just from a social context, but rather from a spiritual commitment, right? Mm-hmm. St. Ignatius of Loyola's spirituality, right? The spirituality that he develops in the spiritual exercises, one of his great contributions to the sort of Western spiritual tradition, emphasizes the need for embodiment, for encounter, for the transformation of the world, right? So that it becomes what it is God dreams that it will be, right? Mm-hmm. And so we have a role to play in this as sort of co-laborers in Ignatian spirituality, co-laborers with God to bring about, right? I mean, in theological language, Craig, that you and I know, the kingdom of God, right? But to bring about a more socially just world. And so you see the Jesuit schools in particular start taking this call up, right? And that they start developing a pedagogy, a way of teaching that brings together not just the important intellectual learning that we do at universities, but equally important, the service component, right? Mm-hmm. And this is why something like service learning has become so important at Jesuit schools here at John Carroll, where I work, but at Jesuit schools across the country and around the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of us aren't used to associating social justice in all of its forms nowadays with any form of spirituality. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, you describe really well that Jesuits have been on about social justice, although I take it the phrase social justice is probably more recent. I mean, I don't know, what did Ignatius of Loyola call it?
Yes, you know? So it's yes, certainly social justice is our contemporary interpretation, right? Our translation, really coming from Pedro Arrupe, but almost more explicitly from Pedro Arrupe's successor as leader of the Jesuits, Peter Hans Kolvenbach, who talks about Jesuit universities being committed to the service of faith and the promotion of justice. And this is where we begin to see the language of social justice emerge. But of course, that those two sort of concepts, the service of faith and promotion of justice, those are what trace their histories back to Ignatius, who founds the religious order of the Jesuits. In his language, right, it is the propagation of the faith and the salvation of souls, right? I think often of the motto of the Jesuits as being a good guide. In fancy Latin, ad maiorem Dei gloriam, inque hominum salutem, right? For the greater glory of God and the salvation, the betterment of humanity. Mm-hmm. And so that's how Ignatius spoke about it. And this is what gets interpreted over the centuries to becoming both the service of faith and the promotion of justice. So social justice for Jesuits and for Jesuit institutions is deeply grounded, right? As is the pedagogy of the universities is deeply grounded in the spirituality. You know, I always tell my students that there are many wonderful philosophies of education and I celebrate them. But at a Jesuit school, our way of being is not grounded in a philosophy, right? It's actually grounded in a spirituality. And that becomes the foundation from which our commitment to social justice emerges. And that gives it a different texture, right? It gives it a little bit of a different flavor. Not better, not worse, just a little bit different the way we do things at Jesuit institutions.
Yeah, I mean, you're really speaking my language. So this podcast is called Grounded in Peace, you know, and I called it that because because I'm interested in, peace movements and articulating perspectives on nonviolence and justice from something very rich, along the lines of what you're talking about. Let me ask you this. So we both work with college students, and you have students at John Carroll in the Arrupe Scholars Program, and you teach courses, I take it, on social justice and nonviolence and advocacy. Talk about how you teach those classes, and I'm particularly interested in how you teach that grounding, and how receptive, because I take it you probably have students there who have Jesuit-ish backgrounds, and then not. Students who are interested in social justice, and maybe they're not too into the whole Jesuit thing. But how do you go about teaching students like that?
Yeah, so let me focus maybe on my two courses that I teach for the first year students in my program. Every fall, I teach a course called Critical Social Justice. And this course really serves as the foundation for the students in the program to understand, first, what is this program they've just gotten themselves into, and what is it? How do we do it a little bit differently here, right? From maybe how they would do social justice or other work at other places. And so I always begin by actually reading the superiors general. These would be the heads of the Jesuit order. Since Pedro Arrupe, each of them has put out, there's been Pedro Arrupe, Peter Hans Kolvenbach, Adolfo Nicolas, and our current superior general, Arturo Sosa. Each has put out a major address, let's say, on social justice, Jesuit education, and how they fit together, right? And so we actually begin the course by grounding it in those documents, right? What is it that this religious order that founded John Carroll University has to say about social justice, right? The grounding in spirituality. We do a quick unit on Ignatian spirituality and Ignatius himself, of course, just to get a little bit of that background. But really drawing from these documents the commitments of the Jesuits to social justice, to peace and nonviolence, right? And what it means to do it from this perspective, right? Certainly, you are correct. We have some students in the program who are coming to us from Jesuit schools, and they kind of know the lingo. But we also have students who are coming at it from different religious backgrounds and from no religious background. And the emphasis is not that everybody has to become a Jesuit, right? But that we see how the Jesuits engage, and we find our own entries into this discourse in conversation with the Jesuits and in conversation with their commitments, right? So we begin there, and then we sort of move into more of the maybe what I'd call the philosophical approach to justice, right? We read, from Immanuel Kant, we read from John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, we read from Aristotle, we read from Martha Nussbaum and Judith Butler and Bell Hooks, all these figures who've talked about justice, right, in different ways. But Jesuits insist that it has to be grounded in action, right? It has to be grounded in embodiment first, and then the theory comes later, right? And so the model of the course kind of models that into the second and third units of the course. And so that's critical social justice. For nonviolent theory and action, this is the course I teach for my first year students in the spring semester. We actually, again, go back to the source of our program, Pedro Arrupe. Pedro Arrupe himself was, as a Jesuit, was stationed just outside of Hiroshima in Japan during the Second World War, and was there the day that the atomic bomb was dropped. He recounts this story and the profound impact that day had on him, and his commitment to nonviolence. And he was never quite the same after witnessing what he witnessed on the day that Hiroshima was bombed. And so we start with that, and then we start talking about, well, what are the different ways we can think about nonviolence? I think people often come to that concept with some baggage, let's say. We all think we know what it means, but unpacking that and finding out, well, there are some differences between what some of the major thinkers in nonviolent theory, whether it's Dr. King, whether it's Mahatma Gandhi, whether it's Leo Tolstoy, all these figures who are inviting us to think about the nonviolent philosophy, right? There's a structure to it. There's a system to it. And this is why this course, one of the things that I found so interesting is more recent work done on nonviolence by scholars like Erica Chenoweth, right? Who are not only saying, yes, this can be morally motivating, this can be spiritually motivating, but actually, if you dig into the data, right, we actually see that nonviolent civil resistance is incredibly effective, more effective than I think all these figures would say our default setting is sort of the contemporary human species, our default setting being violence. That's what we sort of gravitate towards. That's what we think works. But the evidence tells us it's a more complicated picture, right? And so this becomes in nonviolent theory in action, a way to, again, introduce these new concepts. And then, just because I have a passion for the arts, we end our course by looking at nonviolence in art, poetry, music, in these different areas to see how it iterates, how artists iterate their nonviolent perspectives and what it can mean. So they're both really wonderful courses that try to not only demonstrate how we ground this project within a particular approach, a spirituality, or maybe a worldview, but also how it then, on the one hand, commits to our intellectual work at a university, but also these courses are all service learning courses. Students are required as part of the curriculum to go out into the community and engage, right? And to serve the community as a way of informing how they then come back to the classroom. It's a very different experience to simply read Dr. King and his philosophy of nonviolence. It's another thing to go into the community, see what is happening on the ground, and then bring that experience back to the more philosophical analysis, the more theological analysis of what happens in nonviolence. What is it? What do we do? And so it's been a really great experience.
That's really inspiring. I mean, hearing that you're beginning with, I guess you'd say, praxis, right? But I mean, some kind of experience, service, and that's built into the course. Is that for all of the courses, by the way, that the scholars take? Is there always a service learning component?
Yes. This is something that I don't know if we mentioned this earlier, Craig, but I'm in my second year as director here. And this has been something, service learning has always been a component of the Arrupe program. It's just built into the DNA of Jesuit social justice. I've been trying to make it more prominent. And so at present, all of the courses that are required courses for the Arrupe program, and we have, basically 2 in your freshman year, and then 1 sophomore, 1 junior, 1 senior. All of these courses have service learning component. We collaborate with John Carroll's Center for Service Learning and Social Action, which really is a powerhouse organization in terms of community partnerships and the pedagogy of service learning. But all of our programs, if you're in the Arrupe program, all of the classes you take with us will have a service learning component.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's really neat. And so you see students engaged in the community or doing some work alongside their reading and their studies. What are some of the ways that you're having students serve the community? I mean, John Carroll's not too far from Cleveland, or what is Shaker Heights is a.
We're right next. We're right in University Heights, technically. Where we're located.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, we're not far from Cleveland, and we partner with a lot of different organizations. Most often through the CSSA, they handle so much of the outreach and the building the bridges, making the connections. For example, the first year students, one of our the primary places where they will serve is actually at the Fatima Family Center in Huff. And it's really interesting because they do this both for critical social justice and for nonviolent theory in action. And, going once a week to the Fatima Family Center and serving either work, with the kids after school program or with senior citizens, you might not initially make the connection between the course content and the experience. And yet, as the semester goes on, as we discuss more in class, and as students build relationships more and more with the community partners, they begin to see that the theory we're discussing really does have real world implications, even in places that they might not have expected. In addition to Fatima, of course, we work with a lot of great organizations. We have students who work with the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless, for NEOC. We have students who serve at the Lutheran Metropolitan Ministry, We have students who serve with the Juvenile Detention Center here in Cleveland, with a great organization, Zelly's Home, that helps mothers who are experiencing maybe homelessness, but also pregnancy and to have a safe place to be and to raise their kids. We work across the spectrum because each of the different organizations, will help students see their classwork in practice in different ways. And so it really makes for great partnerships. And that all comes through our Center for Service Learning and Social Action. Really a great partner here.
So you have a partner kind of organization or center as part of the university that helps organize these things.
Yeah, the CSSA does a lot with building those relationships around the community and then helping us match our students to the right placements.
Good. So if a student has a particular kind of interest, you'll work with them and. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. CSSA does a great job of finding what people can be passionate about, and sort of triangulating their passion, course content, and the needs of the community partner, and finding a way how do we bring all these into a constructive, fruitful dialogue that can serve the course, serve the student, and of course serve the community partner.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's really good. I want to ask you, so say more about the connection between the spirituality and the service or social justice. I mean, I take it that's so essential and basic. And I know you already talked about it a little bit, but on the other hand, it seems like that's those two aren't always put together. In fact, often it's as though we are made to choose between them, because spirituality can sound like a very kind of private interior enterprise that maybe it's more effective when we can shut out the world rather than engage with the world. And yet we're talking about a spirituality that's deeply engaged with the world as an essential element of its meaning. I don't know how to ask it. I mean, well, more about that. Like, how do you articulate that connection?
I, as I do in so many things, I go back to St. Ignatius, right? Who himself, when he came to his more sort of religious, spiritual life, which for him came later in life after a very traumatic experience, and he was a soldier, had his leg basically blown off, and he had a lot of time at home at the family castle to recuperate. But he himself narrates in his autobiography the journey that his spirituality was. He writes the autobiography later in life so he can look back and see as he sees it, the movement of God, right, in his life. And Ignatius also thought at the beginning that the spirituality was supposed to be something a little bit more, maybe private isn't quite the right word, but he was driven by a very particular understanding of what it meant to live the spiritual life, right? There was no cutting of the hair. There was very little bathing, long fingernails, this kind of asceticism. But over time, he comes to understand that God, for him, is not calling him to a life apart from the world, right? Perhaps there are those whom God does call to that, but it wasn't Ignatius. Ignatius was called to a life in the world. And this is one of the reasons that the Jesuits are, they try to balance, right? Both the traditions that Ignatius would have known at the time, the mendicant tradition and the monastic tradition, right? So the monastic tradition, which was so renowned for its learning and its study, Ignatius wanted that because he wanted those in his religious order to be the best and the brightest. He wanted that level of education. But he was also very moved by the mendicant orders, right, who were out in the world serving the poor, serving the needs of the community. And he wanted to bring those two things together. And so the spirituality that Ignatius develops is one that is kind of a spirituality with its eyes wide open, will you say? Mm-hmm. So it's about encountering the divine, encountering God in the world, right? As we say in Jesuit schools, finding God in all things, that insofar as God cares enough to continually create, right? And this is part of Ignatian spirituality, is that creation didn't just happen for those of us in the Christian tradition back in Genesis, right? Creation is an always ongoing process, right? Mm-hmm. And insofar as God continues to do it, right, we too have a responsibility to continue to care and to collaborate with God as best we can in bringing about creation, right? And so it's a spirituality that is deeply dedicated to the world, right? Not because the world is separate from God, but because everywhere you look, as the great, Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins would say, it is infused with the glory of God, right? From every pine cone you pass on the street, to every face of the stranger, to every sunset you see, to every, spiritual practice you do. Those are all opportunities for God to reveal God's self to us, if only we pay attention, right? And that's what Jesuit spirituality and the Jesuit commitment to social justice is about. How do we pay attention to the ways in which God is trying to reach out, trying to communicate with us, right? We oftentimes do not hear when God is trying to speak to us, but the Jesuits say that we always have to be listening, right? Paying attention. And this is why the spirituality and the commitment to social justice is so deeply embodied, right? Because we live in the world and God can reveal God's self in the world. And so that's where we have to pay attention. That's why it matters that molecular biologists, historians, and architects, all do this kind of practice, this practice of the spiritual practice, to see the ways in which God can reveal God's self. And that's why the spirituality is so important to social justice and, say, the Jesuit key or Jesuit idiom, because it's precisely that kind of spiritual commitment that leads the Jesuits to be engaged in the world rather than be cut off from the world. Ignatius wanted it that way. The Jesuits, since Ignatius, have committed themselves to this, and we see it in particular in somebody like Pedro Arrupe, right, who really lives that spirituality in practice.
Wow, wonderful! I'm feeling very Jesuit listening to you. Extremely Jesuit.
Hey, I won't say the year that I started in high school, but it was a while ago, and I have been in Jesuit education almost nonstop, almost ever since. So it's a pretty compelling narrative and a pretty compelling experience.
And you've been practicing it. It is compelling. Wow. Well, I mean, that's wonderful. I think we should probably just leave it there. I mean, unless you have some final thoughts. It's really exciting, I should say. And I'm really grateful for you to take the time telling us a little about the Scholars Program and Jesuit commitments to social justice and a little bit about your own journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Craig, and thank you for having me on. This was a lot of fun. It was a great experience. And, I really invite any listeners, if they're interested, if maybe they're, high school students wondering what the next step is, or perhaps they're here at John Carroll and they're wondering how to make their experience even richer, come find us, the Arrupe program. We're on the John Carroll website, of course. We're in St. Ignatius Hall, because every Jesuit school should have a St. Ignatius Hall. But I really want to thank you, Craig, for this opportunity just to talk not only about the program, which I'm very proud of, but and the students who are in it, who are really wonderful, but also the spirituality and the tradition that frames it, because I think that's something, in every generation is important. And I think particularly for us today, this commitment to a social justice informed by a spirituality is really a really important part of the conversation. So I thank you for bringing it to light for us.